Hey guys, this will be video 9 for the how to design build a 50s era Explorer replica. And I'm going to continue discussing the neck in fairly boring detail. This is not for entertainment, trust me, because it's not very attractive. But then I'll progress in, or I'll segue into talking about the body at the latter half of the video. So I got a ton of ground to cover. Let's just dive in and talk about what's in front of us. In the last video, I covered extensively how I roughed out these pieces here, very intentional based on grain orientation, growth rings, and all that jazz, color, you name it. I intentionally have not done anything else to it because I wanted to show this in the video series. Because I had mentioned in the last video, oh yeah, the next time you see it, it'll be almost finished, and I'm really bad about that. I jumped the gun, and I always forget that the only reason someone's going to spend 4 to 6 to 12 hours watching my videos on how to do something is eventually they're going to figure out how I'm going to treat the truss rod and the truss rod fillet and all that stuff. And if I blow through that stuff, I wasted everybody's time. So I'm not going to apologize because I obviously always try to catch that. So that's what I meant by on the front end. This is probably going to be pretty boring for most of you guys because this is truly how to build a guitar neck. And this could be your Kramer type neck. This could be your own custom design strat oriented neck. Sky's the limit because not only have we done the droop, but we've done the taper as well. So this is pretty much the pinnacle of guitar building, neck building. And you might think, well, yeah, it's not a jazz guitar. Well, the only difference, if it were a jazz guitar, the only difference would have been that triangle would have been left in there, and this ear and this ear would have been identical, and it would have looked like a big paddle. And then you cut your big, beautiful D'Angelico type jazz guitar, Benedetto type jazz guitar headstock out of that. So what's the difference? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. This is exactly what my jazz guitars look like when I'm building them. So if anything, I owe all my thanks to Robert Benedetto for the video series that he provided for how I used to study or learn how to do this. So if you want to learn how to build a guitar, truly build an awesome guitar, get the Robert Benedetto video series. You get them from Stuart McDonald. So anyway, so everything that you see in front of you is based on what I learned from watching his series. So this ear is different from that ear in order to achieve a different type of guitar. And the next move, as I had mentioned, I spent a lot of time talking about the truss rod and what sort of mindset you need to be in. You could have run it with a table saw and just run it all the way out the tail end, and then come in and just had done a little fillet. But I like this type work because it really shows your ability as a a quality woodworker and a quality carpenter to do just really good carpentry work. And then this kind of is along the lines of like the little walnut, or I think they might have used rosewood, the back of the fender necks back in the 50s when they were installing the truss rods in the back. That's kind of reminiscent of that there, rather than just gluing in a cheap squatty square and fillet. Really take the time to do beautiful work, especially if you're doing a video series where you're showing people that you care about doing things like that, so much so that anyone should realize, wow, if you do that type work, which is never going to be seen again unless someone were to remove the fretboard, then odds are all the other work that was designed and implemented was probably just as good. Okay, I had mentioned that's epoxied in, and this has been acclimating for about 3 days now, because I started to go ahead the next day and just knock all this off and make it all pretty, but then, as I mentioned earlier in the video, that wouldn't have been fair to you guys. So I took the time to do some other things and just progress through the job as this was setting over into the side. And then anyway, so we're going to pick back up and talk about what's in front of us. And what is in front of us is a neck that has not moved. Let me get the grade. It's beautiful. It's perfectly flat. Okay, so this whole acclimation process also lets you know that, yeah, not only was the wood extremely well kiln dried, but everything's just beautiful. There's no warpage. It's nice and flat. And then, this type stuff doesn't matter right now. You could look at it if you wanted to, just to kind of monitor it, and also just kind of sight down it and make sure it's not twisting. And it's not. Obviously, the good thing about working with woods from suppliers that furnish wood to luthiers, to instrument builders, they know the importance about getting the moisture content right on the front end in the whole kiln drying process. And then we, as builders, our shops need to be ice cold. I don't know how else to say it, but you can't do this stuff in a garage with the garage door open and it's rainy one day and then it's beautiful the next, and then it's hot and humid the day after that. Uh, uh, if you are going to work in an environment like that, only work in that environment in the dead of winter when it's real dry and real cold. So I'm gonna stop and get back to basics. But the next move would be, okay. So how did I do this? I did go ahead before these ears were glued on. I did run this down the. Uh, I'm sorry, I ran it this way. Where am I? Yeah. See, this is the straight edge, the straight end. So I ran it across the router table and got the truss rod fit. Then after that, I had already machined all of this stuff right here for doing fillet work, because the fillet is a two-step process. You got just the 1/4 inch wide fillet back here, which drops down in the body, like I said, we're going to say about 1/8 of an inch, but it's a little bit less. Don't go too thin because you want to have a little bit of structural integrity there. But also, if it's 1/8 of an inch deep, don't rip a piece 1/8 of an inch and try to epoxy it in, because there might be a cricket in there that pushes it a little bit low in the middle, a little bit high. When you're gluing this, when you're epoxying this in, this is before this piece was put in. This one was epoxied in first, and I typically just do something like that, and then I clamp it, and that assures me. And it doesn't have to be a lot of force, just enough to make certain that the truss rod is really bedded in the channel. You don't have to put any glue or any epoxy or anything down in the truss rod. As a matter of fact, I don't intentionally, because in case I forget, as I am epoxying this in, I'm always making certain that the truss rod is still turning, and there's no sort of weirdness or binding, even as that epoxy is gluing. Okay, last thing you would want is for something weird to happen there. All right, I'm digressing, so let me get back on point. But you get this epoxied in first. You still haven't done the ears. You got those roughed out, ready to do that stuff later on. But the reason I did all this machining is then I got on my table saw. Well, actually, these were already machined. Okay, so this fillet right here is flat, of course, on the bottom in order to sit atop the truss rod, which is also flat. But out here, if you recall, obviously it's round and it's considerably long as well. It's about that long and it's all round. So on the same 3/8 inch channel that I cut here, you probably won't be able to see the truss up in there, but you will in a moment. I go ahead and cut this little piece here, and then I'll go ahead and just cut them straight. I put this on my miter saw and just chop off a little 2.5 inch, 3 inch long piece, whatever. Well, it's probably about 2 3/4. And then while the epoxy is still on the paper from where I epoxied this one in, I scoot that level back so that there's plenty of room for me now to epoxy this little fillet in. That way they're epoxy gluing together back here, all around up here. That's all drying. And then the next day you'll be able to come in and take your pull saw. I've already relieved this. And the last thing I want to do is get cut. I'm just going to do a really rough cut. So, and you might see that, see how that's a little bit proud? no sense in trying to do this right here unless you want to. It's not a big deal to go ahead and just use your flush cut. So I got to watch that blade because that thing is so dangerous. You could go ahead and flush it up like that right there and just relieve that all the way off. But you run the risk of, creating an indentation that you don't need to, because we're about to come in with our small router and we're going to route all that off flush. So go ahead. So I just say, when I'm cutting something like this, I put about a 1/16 of an inch piece of material under there. I use a square. It doesn't matter. Just put anything you got up under your flush cut saw that will raise it up a little bit. And then that guarantees that you don't come over here and tear off that corner, which is actually almost the finished guitar. You are at a point now where you've got to really be careful about these corners over here, because one hard scar on that end right there, and you'll cut off the guitar that was actually visible. Okay, so you got to start, even though it's ugly, you got to start treating it to the point that you know that, yeah, man, I may be within 1/8 of an inch up here of the finished guitar, so you got to protect it. Okay, so I'm going to do just that. I'm going to pause the camera, and I'm going to. All right, okay, so I already talked about how you use that to assess the thicknesses, and then you machine that out. I already talked about how you use that to verify that your truss rod is staying straight. So let me get this stuff off the table, and let's talk about the next little cowboy jig. These have to be identical, whatever they are, and whatever it is that you're planing off. And you might probably already see what's going on here. Is I'm going to just use that to just surface that down. And as I'm working the bit closer to this flat edge right here, then I'm getting to the point where I'll be almost flush with the top. So much so that I'm pretty good. I'll be able to take it pretty much all the way to the top, but then I'll be able to come in here with some 120 and go zip, 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 and she's finished. Okay, so let me pause. I'm going to knock that off, and then now you see why I left that a little bit high, because as I knock this off, I'll go ahead and just let me make sure I'm not making any assumptions. I'm going to be plain. This is going to go in my carpenter's jig. Carpenter's vise, and then I'm going to be planing that off flush with the top of the lower, and then I'm going to simply come up here and I'm going to let this ride on this, and then I'm going to plane that off as well. That way I'm not having to, do any major sanding. Let the tools do the job where they can, but be careful trying to use a tool to go all the way to the finish line. If you recall in one of my last videos, about 3 or 4 videos back, probably further back, I don't know any woodworker or any carpenter that has ever used a router bit to go all the way to the finish line. You cross the finish line with your sandpapers. Okay, so let me pause, do some routing, and then I'll finish that line with the sandpaper. Okay, I'll pick up briefly and just go ahead and show you. This was just the one cut pass, and I failed to mention, and I knew I was going to have to do it, but I had to knock off that little corner in order to give myself some movement there. And since the fact that the headstock is, okay, so this is the neck right here. It's going to be very, very close to that right there. Every bit of this is getting cut off anyway. So that doesn't have to be very pretty, but, be careful. Just make sure you get it out of your way so you don't run the risk of it tipping you. Because the whole idea of what we're doing here, we're getting ready to level this off so we can draw a very refined outline. Not that we're going to cut it immediately, but at least so that we'll know where we're working. So let me pause again. I'm going to knock this off flush, and then I'll decide what to talk about next. Okay, one more pass and it'll be finished, but I thought I'd just kind of show you the progress. This is 2 passes, and we're already very close to our target. but still about a 32nd of an inch high. And I failed to mention, since this is very close to the finish edge, and I mean extremely close, you got to watch this like a hawk, because as I had mentioned about the finish edges, I failed to clarify that that corner right there, if I drop this neck and it hits something really hard, I'm going to be doing some repair in order to get that under control, because that is actually the finished guitar, because see, it's tapered. So you got to protect that. And I use a triangular wedge, and I put the wedge right here. This is real soft pine. No, I'm sorry, that's cedar. That's a Western red cedar. And I love working with a Western red cedar because it's pretty much the softest wood you could use. And then you put the cedar up against there, put it in your carpenter's clamp, torque her up nice and tight. And then this, everything about the, obviously that can't be high because it would be in the way. So you want this to be below the finished surface, and then this whole thing to be coming out of the carpenter's clamp slightly. And the target is this right here, correct? And basically what I do at this point is just start bringing the bit up, and I can see it right there. It's barely, there's barely any daylight under that. But I know for a fact if I'm not catching the bit right there, and then I'm going to just I'm going to put that up against there, and I'm going to hold it up in the light, and I'm looking at it, and it's very close. Probably so much so that I probably won't even have to sand it if I don't want to. So let me pause, finish the route work, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so we got that level, nice and finished. Turned out really good, and then beautiful right there. The next operation you're going to want to do is don't machine this out yet finished, because you've got to apply your veneer. But I like the idea of going ahead and finding out exactly what the headstock is going to machine out at. Again, you're not going to try to cut this out and shape it by hand, because you spent all this time building this jig in order to allow you to just run the router around it. But nonetheless, you do want to put this up here and make the determination of, oh yeah, that's exactly the guitar I want. Or maybe you've been toying with the idea of making it just, an 1/8 of an inch longer, because maybe you were fearful that it wasn't going to fit in a case or something like that. And now you know it will fit. So now's the time to really make that decision, because what you're about to do is cut this out to within about 1/8 of an inch all the way around, maybe a little bit bigger, not too much. But then once you cut that out to 1/8 of an inch, that's exactly what I'm about to do. I'm going to pause again. Then I'm going to epoxy this to the top. You could use the tight bond. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, because you can use this as the clamping caul by which, let's just go ahead and go through this hypothetically. You put your tight bond down. It's nice and clean. It's level. It's flat. It's all that jazz. And then you put this down, and then you put this down. You put the clamps on it. You flip off the lights, and you go out. That's fine. I like the idea of using the epoxy wherever I can, because I just know that it guarantees a phenomenal join, a little bit additional tonal minimal. With something like this, it's probably not even measurable. But nonetheless, there's no sense in having an enormous headstock up here that you glue every bit of this up here on waste, because there may be 2 Explorers right there, or there may be one Explorer, and there may be an Explorer right here. I got too much crap on the table. There may be an Explorer right there, and there might be a Les Paul right there. Okay, so I'm just always thinking about, how can I guarantee that I don't cut this the wrong way, and that's why I like having the paper templates, because you might think that that's the best use of the cutout, but you lost a lot of the maple right here. only to find that while this right here, and I'm beginning to see it right now, that's how I'm going to do it. Okay, and I don't think this is a digression at all, because 3 months from now when you're building another guitar and you look over in your box, you realize, oh, I gotta what, or you might realize that, oh, it needs to be up here, or up here. You guys already know that stuff. But I think the fact that that's sticking out so far down there, it'll probably end up being cut out like that. And then I'll epoxy that on there, or a tight bonded on, and we'll be getting much closer to a finished guitar. So let me pause again and start cleaning some of this up. Then I'll level this nice and smooth, because see, there's no sense right now in leveling all of this when it's going to get dropped off anyway. And before I forget, there's a strong possibility that 3/4, about 5/8 of an inch of this entire ear is going to get cut off. I don't really want to do that. And if my end grain is really beautiful and it looks good, we'll cross that bridge later on. But that's what I meant by I was trying to re-engineer the whole headstock design. So let me clean this up a little bit, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the rest of the guitar. Okay, I didn't realize you could pause the video that long. I've been fooling around with it for about 20 minutes or so. I went ahead and actually sanded it very nice, but about 1/8 of an inch bigger than the actual guitar. And what's amazing is that's really beautiful. That's considerably bigger than what it will be. And I don't recommend we stay this big, but that's closer to my Kramer-esque design, or it actually was from my old Kramer. But I wanted to see what's going on with the end grain from the neck as it blends in to the little ear that I glued on. And before I took that ear off, I wanted you to be able to see what you could kind of anticipate. See how you see the grain, the growth rings in this tree, or this board is very much quarter sewn. Well, then so are the lines here. Now, the funny thing about the Korina, it's got kind of a real wiggly pattern, which is just, it's in its natural state. You're not going to change that. You can see how wiggly it is right there. I don't really know what causes that. It's beautiful in its own right. But when you are blending this little corner to this, at a minimum, you're giving yourself the option to leave that corner on, and then do this upper part however you choose. Now, I sanded this just a little bit on the orbital sander, but the main thing I wanted to do here is, see, the black line represents where I took the, let me back up. This is critical, and I should have mentioned this as soon as I fired the video back up. After I'm getting ready to sand the devil out of that and just really level that. Okay, I'm gonna sand that really nice and flat and clean. So once I do that, I'm gonna lose my identification mark for my center line. So I took a pen, a real fine pen, and I defined that center line again. And then I came down here and see, I've already erased it. I'm glad I'm doing this on. Let me just do it again, because I've got to be looking directly over it. It's actually not that important. It kind of is and it kind of isn't. But if you're getting ready to sand this, then make the center mark here and verify that the center mark is up here on this flat, and make little notes for how you might want to do the rest of the job, so that if you're sitting there asking yourself, is it okay to go ahead and taper that a little bit? Yeah, because I'm going to use a different jig to cut my tenon. So this neck is already tapered on one side, so I've lost the ability to have an S4S board to cut the tenon. So on that note, I'm going to be doing all that differently, and it wouldn't have mattered if I had gone ahead and sanded that taper all the way in there. So what you're doing at this point, you're easing your way up to this finish line right here, which is defined by your master template. Okay, I think we all know that. got your maple ready. It's ready to go. So this is an eighth of an inch bigger than the finished guitar, and this is about an eighth of an inch bigger than even that right there, maybe a 16th. It's for the most part, I know it's bigger, so it's ready to be epoxied down. Oh, so the next thing is level this ever so slightly. If you did a really good job with your glue up, you remember what I mentioned about glue this up on the top so that it's very close to flush, and then clean up the back later on. We'll address that in a little while. But this is ready to just be hit, 3 or 4 times and just kind of cleaned up so that I can then epoxy the veneer atop it. And then once you paint your black nitrocellulose lacquer atop this, you actually come down about a 32nd of an inch to a 16th of an inch, and you tape it off and you let the nitro come over a little bit, and it shows a little bit of kind of like artificial thickness, and it's really pretty. Rather than just doing the black on the top and then sanding it flush, that would look kind of chintzy, okay? But by going ahead and doing the sanding, it allowed me to start asking myself, what does that end grain look like? Well, I'm not there yet, but there's a strong possibility this is going to get cut. Almost about 99% certain this is going to get some sort of real clean, beautiful, flat board like this, cut down and carried up here, and then that will be the end grain. That's what I meant by, I think it's far more attractive to see that rather than to see all the end grain. Well, I say that. Me being a builder and a woodworker, I love seeing the end grain, but don't expect your client to like things like that. So I would say probably go ahead and plan on putting this veneer. But know this, that once this, let's say you cut off a 1/4 of an inch all the way down, all the way down, all the way down, just know that once you hit this point right here, you're going to see a transition. You're going to see a glue line. Just the same, well, barely, because of the Korina. The Korina hides the glue line so well. That's why they did that. Okay. So anyway, it probably will get that. And another reason to do that, and I've already talked about the central line, so I can get that pin out of the way. Because of the whole pitch of the headstock, this is 14 degrees, and the fact that your material is typically under 2 inches, that right there, that little flat, represents this plane right here. If this board had been thicker, then this would have been permitted. This taper would have been permitted to go on up and finish out. But that being the finish height, eventually, once you cut this trapezoidal path or this pitch, eventually it's going to come out of it and leave a little flat. Therein is another reason why, I can't believe I don't have a small board. Yeah, I got a small board. All the more reason why they came in with a board up here and went across that top, and it covered that. Now, I like the idea of doing a stinger, the black nitrocellulose lacquer, but I'm going to build this guitar so that it won't require a stinger. But if I were building this guitar for myself, man, I would glue in a little piece of no, I'm sorry, I take that back, because it would show on the end grain. Okay, so everything I just said, this is going to have to get some sort of board on the end. But if I were going to paint this whole headstock black, I would just epoxy in a little triangle right there. I'd sand it all level, and then I'd spray the whole thing black and be done with it. I don't do stuff like that, but that's an option. Okay, so what would be the next one? Let me check the time. 29 minutes. It feels like it's been more closer to an hour, because it actually has. It's actually much longer than that with all the pausing. So I'm just going to try to not sound like I'm in a hurry to end the video, because I'll probably get about another 10 minutes. So what would be the next thing? The next thing would be to do exactly what I'm about to do here on camera, is verify that I've got my mark up here, my center line identified there, and my center line identified there. This shouldn't be very noisy, but I just cradle it in my hands. and I hit it once or twice to kind of see what's going on. And then let me get a pencil. When you're working by hand, the pencil does not lie. And this is really important, and you'll be shocked how much material you could take off and it remain perfectly flat in its original plane. I'm sanding cross grain. I'm asking myself, see I got a little bit heavy down here, so let me level out. If anything, that little ear is a little bit proud intentionally. It's good. And that's really all it needed. And don't worry too much about squarenesses right here, because once this veneer, well, I say that, don't get too hand heavy out there, because that, and also don't let it deceive you. You might look at that and go, oh wow, I got out a square. Don't go there, because just know that the grain in this wood is going uphill, and everything that you see is very much deceptive. So don't trust that you just got that line off. But nonetheless, what I probably should have done was made an identifying line back here for squareness where the fretboard began, and then just kind of watched it. But I didn't hit it enough to make any difference, other than I did not sand any down there. I do know that, because I was just sanding up here. But let me do this. 120, you saw what? 60 seconds, 45 seconds of sanding, and you see how much dust. That's one thing I've noticed about this stuff. It really sands off very, very, very fast. All right, the next thing would be to epoxy your maple down. And probably getting very close to ending the video. So I'm going to talk about, in other words, I'm not going to do that unless I do it at the very end of the video. That's probably how I'll do that. And then, so on that note, let me just set that right there. And let's talk about what would be next. There's no sense in cutting this is really important. I'm glad I thought of this. Think of this job along the lines of, okay, once I mix up epoxy and once I put this down and I come across it with some sort of clamping caul, it's spelled C-A-U-L, some sort of clamping caul, and then I have to put it in a jig, is it now going to restrict me from cutting the tenon and doing all the beautiful machine work for fitting this into the body? Well, I don't have the body glued together yet, so I don't have a tenon, but I know exactly what this tenon is going to be. So I say that to say this: as you're working through a job, know when to press pause and put this over to the side, and know that this is about 1/8 of an inch bigger than the original or the finished guitar. So if you bump the corner of the table, it's not going to be the end of the world, because that's not even the finish edge. But if you went ahead and machined this really beautiful and really, really precise, and you drop this thing on the floor, you might have just eaten the candy bar. So I say leave it big. Even though it's pretty, we only made it pretty so that we could see what's going on grain-wise. We've already talked about that. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm close enough to this work to put it on pause. Now I'm going to transition into going ahead and tapering this very close to the finished guitar. I say that. That's probably not accurate, but I'm not going to rely on this straight edge right here, which is the original rough sawmill mark, to be trusted along my table saw fence. I'm sorry, what I'm about to do is start cutting the tenon, and I dropped my pencil. Okay, it's basically right there. Basically what I'm going to do is, where's the center, 3/4. It's probably somewhere in there. That's probably, yeah, that's way too small. It's much bigger than that. The tenon, what am I saying? Yeah, I should know that. The tenon comes out closer to like this. All right, sorry about that. So, I'm gonna be coming up here on the table saw and just cutting out that little relief. So if I had all this beautiful stuff glued in place, well then I'd be fighting that as I'm trying to work on the table saw. So I'm gonna go ahead and do all this work, do all this real precise machine cutting. Oh yeah, I've got the mahogany. So it'll look very much like that right there. But then when you flip it over, it'll look like this right here. And then tonight, before I get ready to call it a night, then I mix up my epoxy, lay that veneer down, put the caul on it, call it a night. That way I know I don't rush myself to try to, I'm sitting there watching the epoxy dry and thinking, oh, hurry up, so I can get that clean so that I could then do this, if that made sense. My order of operations were such that I did as much work as I could before I finished the headstock, and in order to make the job actually go a little bit smoother and faster. Even so much so, I don't even have to do this today. I could do this tenon, finish the tenon 100%, then I could go ahead and set up my router station and go ahead and build the neck. In other words, machine the neck. See what I'm saying? Before the headstock is even finished. So just imagine, we're looking at that right there, in that state. But then I go ahead and take this piece of material all the way up to that state right there. Who says I can't do that? Of course I can. And if anything, that's actually a really smart move because it allows me to continue to do more and more heavy machine work and not have to worry about damaging the headstock. Okay? So keep that in mind. Don't get too overzealous when you're doing your job and try to take it all the way to the finish line up here. Just know when to pause and move on and do another part of the job. But I will say this, that where we are at this state in the job, that's very rewarding visually, and it starts getting you really motivated to just, keep building your job. So, and when I was talking about doing the epoxy, I use the T88. That's a 24-hour West System epoxy. I used to use that down in South Florida when I was restoring my boat. And that stuff's incredible. It's 24 hours, gives you plenty of time. And once it dries, it's like stone. It's the tap tones are incredible. So again, Titebond is perfectly fine for this up here. I just don't really care for water-based glues when it comes to veneers, because when I used to build jazz guitars a lot, and I was working with exotic veneers. A lot of times those exotic veneers would be just that. They're burl, they're heavily figured, and as soon as they get wet, they start curling up like a wet piece of paper. Well, not even, that's not even a good comparison. They just start curling up, and they're very difficult to fight, and you have to treat them with some sort of water-based chemical. It looks like milk, and I never liked that. I like just putting the epoxy down, putting that burl veneer or whatever it may be down, then having a really serious caul over here that I was ready to put in some major clamping force. And I'm talking like 6, what do you call them? Not C clamps. There's nothing wrong with using C clamps though. Don't crush it, but cabinet clamps, like 6 cabinet clamps with some fairly tight wrist pressure, and that really keeps your exotic veneers under control. I'm gonna stop talking about that because we're not building a jazz guitar. We're not building an exotic veneer headstock, and this maple's very forgiving. So the tight bond is fine if that's what you prefer to use, but I will be using epoxy. All right, let me check the time. And what I'm going to do is pause again, reorganize, and then I'll end the video there after that. Okay, I should be able to end the video here in a minute or two. The next move will be to cut the tenon, as I mentioned. And the reason I like the idea, as I've mentioned numerous times, there's the 19th fret. There's the 19th fret. When I built this guitar on paper or construction paper, it really helped me kind of envision what my end goal was. Now, the paper template that I drew is my own custom headstock, as I've mentioned before. Well, it's very, very much the Kramer guitar I owned a long time ago, but a little bit different. I did shape it a little bit. But nonetheless, if you build the guitar on paper, even I went ahead and did the actual fret scale and drew every individual fret out so that if I need to know where the 12th fret is on this neck, I got it. If I need to know where the 7th is or the 5th, I got it. If I need to know where the 1st is, I got it, and I don't have to pull out a measuring tool. But what I mentioned is I'm getting ready to cut this tenon, meaning I'm going to be relieving this material here and that material right there and leaving the tenon, which we all know what a tenon is. And so it's not much material that I'll be removing, but it is critical that what I do cut out is perfectly precise in relation to the center line of the neck. If I get that off, then it's going to make my fitment job so much more difficult and so much more frustrating. So I got to really take the time to do this right and do it right the first time, as they say. And how do you do that? Either with a router or with a table saw. And I like a table saw. I'm so much more comfortable with a table saw. And I don't know where the 19th fret is on this template, but if you were going to use a router, just know that that's your heel location. And if you happen to have a Stuart McDonald template laying around, well, you put that on the center and you put that on the center and you either clamp it or you jet glue it down, then you pick up your router and you start taking off little bitty bites. Don't try to route the whole thing off. You'll end up tearing it apart. But you just take off what it is that you need to take off and just work your way down. And see, this will guarantee that you don't encroach on your heel. But just I don't like the router for that. When I'm at this point, all I need is 2 tools. And I'm gonna stop talking about the router option because if that's your option, then you're probably better with a router than I am anyway. All I need are 2 different tools. I need my miter saw and I need my table saw. And I take my miter saw and I cut this and this on the appropriate pitch that I want to put the neck and the body. I'm going to be putting this one in at just slightly over 1.5. I did some more engineering and I think 1.5 degree pitch is much better than a 2-inch. A 2-inch degree pitch would probably be a little bit, not high, but just a little bit more than they would have put it in originally. So I'm going in a little bit over 1.5. I'll cut that on my miter saw, but only go about, that deep. I basically will cut only deep enough to make certain that I cut through the whole thing and then I stop, because then I'm going to come in with my table saw and a jig that I'm not going to start talking about, but basically I'll be taking my putting this on my table saw, and it'll be very similar to just this right here. And imagine there's a perfect center line down the middle. And let's say this is a perfect number. Let's say it's 4 inches or something like that. Then you fasten your neck. See, since your neck is rough, it's tapered on this side. It's BS flat on that side, non-trustworthy. It's got that sand work done right there. You got to get this straight so that once you go to your table saw, you'll be yawning. It'll be so easy to cut this because you'll have a fence. I'm sorry. Just imagine that's fastened somehow or another to that little flat jig. You could come in with a toggle clamp if you want, but I wouldn't recommend it because it would get in the way of your fence. I would say just either jet glue it down or put the jet glue right on the neck. Don't even put any tape and just kind of temporarily, permanently glue it straight to that because this board has got to be perfectly S4S. If it's off, then so will your tenon be. Okay, so make certain that whatever you do elect to use as your jig to help you put this up on your table saw and go up there and cut, and the table saw blade's up fairly high, and then you cut up until you watch and you know when to stop, and then you do one of two things. Either you move your fence over to the other side and you reposition it and you cut that side, or what I simply do, I cut one cut on the inside of the blade and then I cut the other cut on the outside of the blade. Okay, and if you don't know what I mean by that, you probably aren't qualified to be doing this anyway. So just enjoy watching the video as we build the guitar. But just know that this is probably the easiest. And I have a tendency to work off the right side of the fence. I know that's a little odd for some people. They like to work off the left side of the fence. But I always work off the right because I like to keep this hand here as I'm doing something and it stays away from the blade. And I'm right-handed, so I'm pushing with my right hand. So let's say that we wanted that blade to come in right here. Well, then we just set the fence according to all of these dimensions, the offset dimensions, and then you just make that first pass. And I think it would be wise to start out a little bit fat, make a kiss cut and verify, where your blade is, then find the correct location and then make one clean pass, and you should have your table identified as to your stop point where the blade will be when it comes down. But be careful about that stuff, but then make that cut, and then on that one you're cutting on the outside of the blade, and then when you move this over, then you'll be cutting on the inside of the blade to relieve that one. And then you'll take your little flush cut pull saw and just saw that off, and voila, you'll have your tenon. So I don't want to show that on camera because I don't want the liability. And if you can't figure out how to cut that based on what I have in front of us right there, again, please stay away from the table saw because the table saw is, as they say, the most dangerous tool in the shop. But if you're building something like this, it's only because you're really confident and you've been working with a table saw for a long time. So I know it was a long video. I hope it was beneficial. And then in the next video, we'll go into body construction. And this guitar is about to come together very quickly. So I appreciate you guys checking in, and I'll see you in the next video.